Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Actually, I should say good evening because for you it's the end of the day. Thank you for joining us for our discussion of best practices in distance education. As you know, we've had a number of webinars to date, and we've learned a lot of interesting and important information from Mary and Susan and I about teaching online and various other topics. Today, we're going to kind of break down, this will not be a webinar that was as useful as Mary's webinar that showed you where to go in Google Classroom and that sort of thing. This is a webinar that's going to go a little bit higher than that and talk a little bit more about conceptualizing the way that you teach online. So hopefully this will be just as useful. Let's make sure that the slides will move. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to say, and we've said this, those of you that studied with us last summer at Nazarbayev University heard this a great deal. And we've said this in many of our training webinars to date. When you're teaching distance education or remote teaching or online teaching or whatever it is that you call the type of teaching that's being done where you and your students are not in the same room, it should be not about the technology. You should not get caught up in this technology is so fancy, I should use this one, or this technology is the one that my students like the most. It should not be about the technology. It should be about the teaching. And the best online teaching actually takes the tenets of what is good and useful in a face-to-face classroom and figures out how to adapt that to be used in an online setting. So it's about the teaching and not about the technology. Technology is constantly adapting and constantly changing, and it is catching up with us. It is doing amazing things for us in the classroom. It is creating ways for us to engage our students in ways we maybe couldn't have even imagined 10 years ago. But it's still all about the teaching, and it's all about what we do with our students and how we engage them. So I have long had a PowerPoint presentation that I give to all the teachers that work with me. And it's called the 5 C's of teaching. Today, we're going to take those 5 C's of teaching and we're going to put them into an online setting, a distance setting. And we're going to talk about those and how they apply to working with your students online. So the first one is connection, community, clarity, comprehension, and collaborative. Connection relates to the way that the students connect with you as a teacher. Community relates to how the entire classroom works together. Clarity is clear and understandable. Comprehension is understandable, sorry. Clarity is clearness. And having your classroom be collaborative is also part of best practice in teaching. So we're going to take each one of these apart a little bit. So the first one is connection with you, the teacher. How can we create a space for students to feel connected to you? So I want you to think about your face-to-face classroom and what ways do you make your students feel connected to you. Obviously, you greet them when they come into the classroom. Perhaps you ask them about their weekend, or you ask them about what they're working on. You create a kind of relationship with them, right? Our difficulty in the online setting is that we can't actually take the time to interact with each student individually, like we can possibly in a regular class. Over the course of the week, ideally, each student would have had some engagement with you, some conversation with you, or some interaction with you, and they would feel a connection to you. So what do we do when best practice tells us that for students to learn and to learn best, they need to connect, they have to have an intellectual connection so that they are being challenged to learn and to grow. They need an emotional connection. They want to please you. They want to get a good grade from you. They want something. They need a psychological connection so that they feel as though they are motivated to learn and they are encouraged and not stymied in your classroom. And they need a social connection, both to their classmates and to you. Wow, that's a lot that we have to accomplish. And we as teachers in our face-to-face classrooms do this all the time. But the challenge is now, if you're going to try and do that online, how can you do such a thing? The first thing that best practice tells us is that the students need to see you and they need to hear you. And this has really improved in the last few years with online platforms that allow us to do exactly what we're currently doing. So you can see me, I'm talking to you as I'm also walking you through the PowerPoint or the activity or what the video, I'm showing you a video, but you can also see my face and you can see me and you can feel a connection with me through the technology, which is much better than it used to be, because it used to be that when you, for example, did a voiced PowerPoint in the olden days, as my children would say, when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, when you did a voiced PowerPoint in the past, each slide you had to record something and then the student had to click a button on the slide to hear what you wanted to say for that slide, and then they would click to move to the next slide. Well, that is not as efficient as what's happening today, where I'm talking, I'm controlling the speed of the slide, and the students can see and hear how we're moving forward. Students, according to best practice research, students need to be able to contact you and receive a response in a timely manner. Now, what that used to mean, teachers used to think, oh, that means anytime my student emails me, I have to respond immediately. And over the course of the evolution of distance learning, we have learned that what we need to do is we need to do what we do in our regular classrooms. We say, I'm available from this time to this time, which is a regular class time. You are welcome to email me or contact me, or we can even connect through video chat during this time. If you send me an email outside of this time, then I will answer within 24 hours. What this allows you as a teacher to do, because it's dangerous to be teaching distance ed, it's dangerous to our work-life balance, right? What this allows you to do is to say, okay, I answer emails to my students best in the morning, or I answer emails to my students best right before I go to sleep. And then you establish your 24-hour period when you sit down and you answer your emails from your students. And then no matter when the student sent you the email, within 24 hours, they will get an answer. This is the timely manner. And this is the way that you establish, and then you establish that expectation, and then you just meet that expectation with your students. Now, we know this. As teachers, we desperately know that students need a routine. They need a place to go to know what's going to happen. Now, think about your classroom. What routines do you employ every day when you're teaching that help your students to understand this is what's expected of me when I walk into this classroom? So perhaps every day in a certain part of the chalkboard or the whiteboard, you have a list of, like, you have a practice activity. So they come in, they set up their desk, and then they start that 2 or 3 question practice activity. Maybe in another part of the board, you have a list of what we're going to do today. Here's what we're going to talk about this first, and then we're going to talk about the next topic, and then your homework's going to be this. And they know that they need to make sure that they check that part of the chalkboard for their homework, right? Online, they need the same thing. So if you're giving them homework, give it to them in the same place every day. If you want them to work through a module online, put the module together in the same way each time, so that they can learn the routine and they can gain an understanding of how they should be performing in your classroom. So the next C is community. So every time a teacher walks into a classroom, every time they start a new class, every time they start the school year and they have a new class, they create a culture. You create a culture. I create a culture every single time. This culture is laden with expectations, just like a big C culture. This is a small c culture, right? Small c meaning it's a culture within the classroom. You establish for those students what is expected. How should they behave? How are they going to interact in your classroom? What kinds of interactions are they going to have? How will they interact with you? How will they interact with each other? How should they prepare? What sort of preparation should they make for each class meeting? When they come to your classroom, they have the general society's understanding of how they should behave. They know they shouldn't sit backwards in their chairs or stand on their head on their desk, right? They know these things, right? These are not expected, right? But the way that your desks are set up in the classroom and the way that you ask students to help each other with assignments or not are all part of you creating this culture and this community and this understanding about how we're going to learn together as a learning community. So in your online classroom, you need to ask yourself some questions, because obviously in your online classroom, you're not going to see all of those students at the same time. You're not going to see all of those students at the same time. So ask yourselves, think about your intentionality. What are your intentions? Now, maybe you haven't ever thought about that in your face-to-face class. Maybe you have walked in and you have taught your face-to-face class and you haven't actually thought about the way that you teach or what sort of culture you want to create. But I'm pretty sure if you've been teaching for a while, you have thought about those things, right? And one of the things is, what sort of culture should we create? And then what sort of culture do we want to create, right? Because we are always, as teachers, stuck between the parameters of what's expected by the school and the parents and the teacher and the other teachers and society, and what we would like to experience or have our students experience in our classroom. And we're always kind of in between these two sets of parameters. We're still in between those two sets of parameters in online education. So a critical point of thinking about intentionality is to think about, what are my learning objectives? What do I want to accomplish with my students? And how will I accomplish this in this online setting? The next thing to do then is to examine your lesson plan or your module, or however you have designed it for your students to engage online, and ask yourself, does this activity or this task or this video that I've chosen, or this video that I've made, or this assignment that I created, do these activities do that? Do they build the culture, build the community that I'm trying to build? And then use the technology to create the culture you want and the one that your students need. I always like to tell a story about teaching writing, and I taught writing for a long time. And when Google developed Google Docs, it changed the way I could teach writing and revision. Because of the way that the technology was designed, I could rethink the way that I taught writing, because it keeps all of the previous versions digitally. It's much easier to show students how a piece of prose or an essay can evolve with good editing and good revision. Until that point, it was very hard to get the students to see that connection between one draft and the next draft. But in the Google Doc, you can see it, right? You can see it if you look at the history. And so Google Docs actually helped me to rethink the way I was teaching writing. So there are times when a new technology will come out and you'll think, oh, I can do this now with my students that I couldn't do before, or I could have done it, but it would have been very labor intensive and maybe not worth the time and energy to get to the same point. So it's always this tug of war between what can be done with the technology and what can't be done, and what you are comfortable in doing. So the next C that we're going to talk about is clarity. I'm checking my time. Okay. The next C we're going to talk about is clarity. And of course, you know this. Clarity is a critical component of teaching always. We have to be very clear about what we want our students to do. We have to be very clear in our directions. We have to be very clear about what our expectations are. We have to be clear all the time. Think about your face-to-face classroom. If you're in your face-to-face classroom and something that you say is unclear, you can tell, right? Your students' eyebrows will furrow, they'll go down like this, they'll kind of, cock their head and kind of look a little confused. It's very easy to see that, right? But we have found with research on online learning, clarity is even more important in online education, because if something is unclear, students more quickly lose interest and motivation and belief in their abilities. It's very, very quick that they can shift in their belief in themselves and in their motivation if we are not clear. So it's also true online. It's even more so. So let's talk about clarity a little bit more. So how do we make things clear to our students? We've already talked a little bit about establishing routines so they know where to look if they get confused. If they're not confused, if they're confused about how to use a piece of technology that you've embedded in it somewhere, they know, oh, my teacher made a video at the beginning of the semester and I can go and look at that. So they know where to look. Excuse me. We've explained to them what the expectations are. We've explained the technology. This is one thing that many teachers online fail to do explicitly. But if there is a kind of technology that you are going to use in your online teaching, you should make a little video explaining to your students how to use that technology so that they can review your video as many times as they need to understand the technology. And then we provide an ongoing question answer feedback location. I often put just a discussion board that's bookmarked, and I have the online platform send me notification every day if someone has posted into that question and answer board so that I can make sure that I'm responding to those questions. But those questions come, and often more than one student in the class might have that question, but they don't all post. And so by having it in a discussion board, it's available for everyone to see and review. Okay, so let's talk a little more about clarity. Now, if you were here the last time I presented, we did a breakout room activity. And we tried to break out into rooms, and we discovered that when you go to the breakout room, you cannot see the questions I was asking. And so I had this very elaborate activity that I was asking for you to do, and you couldn't do it because you couldn't see the slide when you were in the breakout room. So this is the trial and error that comes when you're trying a new piece of technology or a new part of technology. So let's talk about this breakout room activity. So the instructions that I gave, now these instructions have been adapted slightly because we're in a different webinar this week, but the instructions were, okay, we're going to go into a breakout room. So when you get there, choose a discussion leader. Think about ways that you could build connection, community, clarity in your physical classrooms, and discuss ways that you could translate that online. And that is pretty typically what the instructions said in the last webinar. So this is a little clear, somewhat clear. This is perfectly good instructions for me to have as a teacher in my notes if I'm teaching a face-to-face class. But this is not a clear enough instructional guideline. These are not clear enough instructional guidelines if I'm going to have my students do this in an online setting. So let's break it down some more, okay? So we're going to improve our clarity of this activity. So the first assignment, the first part of the instruction said breakout room. Well, do we know that the students know what a breakout room is? In this webinar, we have 100 people in the rooms right now, in the webinar right now. Last time we had 48, we had half as many. So there's a chance that in this webinar today, there are people who don't know what a breakout room is. So ideally, if I were giving this in an online setting, I would add some more explanation. It could be something as simple as this. We're going to enter a breakout room where you will have time to discuss with your classmates. But ideally, I would also say that you will only have 5 people in the breakout room. You will be able to talk to each other. I would give a bit more explanation. Once we have established what a breakout room is, and I've used it a couple of times, I could reduce the instructions to say something like this. Oh, we're going to go into the breakout room for 5 to 7 minutes. And then once I've established it, you know what a breakout room. But notice I've added the time limit so that at least you know how long you're going into the breakout room. So let's look at the next part. The next part of the instruction said, choose a discussion leader. Well, if you're in your classroom and you have 30 students in your classroom, and you say, okay, get into groups of 5 and everybody pick a discussion leader. In theory, your students over time know each other, and that discussion leader kind of evolves, right? But in a setting like this one, where you might not know anyone else in your breakout room, you can't just say, choose a discussion leader. You have to give more clarity to that task. And so you could say, choose a discussion leader. The discussion leader is the person who has a name closest to the beginning of the alphabet. So what do you have to do when you go into that breakout room? What you have to do then is you have to introduce yourselves, and then we all say, okay, Anna, you are the discussion leader because your name is closest to the beginning of the alphabet. But notice it says your name. You can also make it clearer if you say the person who has a first name closest to the beginning of the alphabet, or a last name. Or you could say the person who has a birthday earliest in the year. Or you could give any other guidance, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to simplify the task for strangers to choose a discussion leader. So we're moving on to more of the instructions. So think about ways that you build connection, community, and clarity in your physical classrooms. Discuss ways that you could translate that online. Now, this is pretty clear. It's not confusing so much, but it is not quite as clear as we would hope it would be. So ideally, as we've been talking through these 3 C's, you have been thinking about your face-to-face classrooms already. So think about, more specifically, one way that you build connection or community or clarity. Notice I've taken it from being think about ways, numerous ways, and I've taken it from connection, community, clarity, all 3 of them together. And I'm allowing you to think about one thing that you thought of when you were listening to the presentation, and then you're going to share it with your group, how you might recreate that online. So notice I have adjusted to make the task much more specific so that the interaction can be more meaningful when you go into the breakout rooms. So let's see how the assignment changed. So we are going to enter breakout rooms where you're going to have time to talk to your classmates about the concepts we've been talking about so far. The discussion leader is the person who has a first name closest to the beginning of the alphabet. Think about your face-to-face classrooms. Think about one way that you build connection or community or clarity, and share with your group how you might recreate that online. Now, we all know that we're teachers and we like to engage and have conversations about and get different ideas. But our students sometimes need a little bit more. And so what we've done is we've established a role for one person in the group, but we have not established what are we going to do with that knowledge. once we come back together as a big group. And so another piece of clarity to add might be to add a note taker. A note taker is a person with a first name closest to the end of the alphabet. And if you're going to have a note taker, then when you return to the main group, the note taker will share one idea from your discussion in the chat. So you see how by breaking down what we would normally do in our face-to-face classrooms, we can improve the clarity of what we're working with when we're trying to move our activities online. Okay? So okay, so this is what our assignment looks like now, and we're going to actually try and do this. We're going to enter breakout rooms, and you'll have time to discuss the concepts we've been talking about. The first thing we're going to try and do, notice I've still changed this, right? I've put the tasks into categories now. First, we're going to establish the roles, the discussion leader and the note taker. And then I say, so introduce yourselves and figure that out, who those people are. And then you're going to have 5 to 7 minutes to discuss one way that you currently build in your face-to-face classrooms, connection or community or clarity, and how you might put that online. When you return to the main group, the note taker will share one of the ideas from the discussion. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move into those breakout rooms. You should have 6 or 7 people in each room. So you should be able to, well, let's do it this way. I can choose the number of breakout rooms. And so I would like to have 4 or 5 so that you get more of a chance to talk. And therefore, you're going to have 4 or 5 people in each of your rooms. So your screen will change and you just follow the prompts on the screen and we will go to the breakout rooms. Okay, welcome back. Seems like everyone's starting to come back from the breakout room. And the point of the breakout room, hopefully you got to at least find out who would be the discussion leader and the note taker. And if you had a note taker and were able to have a discussion, I would like to ask you to add some of your ideas into the chat so that we can all see that. Obviously, with a group this large, we cannot have everyone talk about what they experienced in the breakout room or each of their ideas. And so the way that we have structured this activity allows us to get some of the reporting that we would have gotten if we were doing it in a face-to-face classroom without having to have everyone report out. So let's go. So note takers, please add your group contributions to the chat and wait a few more minutes. It looks like we still have a few people who are still coming back from the breakout rooms. But any of you who have been doing any kind of distance education for any length of time, you know that these breakout rooms and this kind of being able to break up the classroom into the class into smaller groups and then bring them back is a game changer. The technology it's a very recent evolution in the technology, and it's exciting to be able to do that in a classroom. I'm teaching currently a graduate class on the linguistics of English, and I have 40 students in 3 sections of the class, and I regularly break those students into groups just like I would in my regular class, and they get to work just like they would in a regular face-to-face class. So let's go on to the last two, because we are running out of time. The last two C's. The first one, the one we're going to talk about now, is comprehension. So in our physical classrooms, in our face-to-face classrooms, how do we make sure that our students are understanding what we're saying or understanding what we're expecting of them? And one of the ways we do that is we look at their faces. We ask them questions. We allow them to ask questions. We give them activities that ask them to apply their knowledge. And we do this in many other ways. The advantage of this kind of technology is because everyone can be here on video. Sorry. Because everyone can be seen on video, for you, if you have a class of 30 students, you could see all of their faces as you're talking to them. Or you could meet with smaller groups and see their faces and talk to them. When I meet with my classes that have 20 students in them and I break them into breakout rooms, I make sure that I give them a task that will take 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And I then am able to visit every single breakout room, and I can see each of the students, and I can see who is struggling and who is not, and what the confusions are. So that's a real advantage of the technology now. The final C that we're going to talk about is collaborative. Research indicates, and we know this, that learning is a sociocultural activity. Online learning and teaching should also be a sociocultural activity. We should create, according to best practice, create synchronous and asynchronous spaces for students to work together. So ideally, the best type of online learning allows for synchronous and asynchronous, although depending on the students and their motivations and their goals, it may be that all asynchronous might be preferable. We need to provide resources for the students for asynchronous learning so they can come together with or without you, and then the sociocultural aspects of learning can be reinforced. And we need to provide enough scaffolding so that the students can be successful together. And if you think about providing scaffolding, think about the activity that we walked through where we changed the directions for the assignment in the breakout room. We made it more explicit, we made it more specific so that the students could be successful when they went into the rooms together. So I'm going to end where I began, which is that distance education and remote teaching is not and should not be about the technology. It should be about the teaching. And if you think about what's good in my classroom, then think about why is it good and how does it meet the learning outcomes, and then adapt it to the online, because it's about the teaching and not the technology. So I would like to thank you for your time and attention today and ask you if you have any questions. Let's look at the chat and see if there's any questions. The PowerPoint will be available for participants on the website. We are almost finished with the website, and once we are finished with the website, you will all have access to it with the PowerPoint and the webinar. It will all be available on the website. So yes. Do I suggest that everyone Zoom? I am not an employee of Zoom, and so I cannot endorse them only. We are currently using Zoom, but there are many platforms, and each one does slightly different things. And so depending on what is critical in your classroom or your interactions, that's what you should focus on. But it's now that video has become part of being able to engage and create together online. I'm working on a paper right now for publication, and the other day I was in a Google meeting with the person I'm talking to, and we were both in the Google document, and we were talking even though we are not even in the same state, but it felt like we were engaging in the same way we used to when we sat at the same table and talked about the same document. So I think the technology is finally catching up with what we have wanted in order to be able to engage and communicate and collaborate together. Yeah, Google Meet, WebEx, Zoom, Skype, that's true. There's all kinds of different platforms. Your breakout room wasn't available. I'm sorry to hear that. We've had some trouble with having so many breakout rooms, and different people have connected like through their phone or through their computer. And I don't know if that's part of what's going on with Zoom and with the breakout rooms. But when I've used Zoom with my classes, not with the webinar, but with my classes, there's not been any trouble with the breakout rooms. Everyone just goes in and comes out, and it's very seamless. It's really been wonderful. Can you control the room's activities in the breakout rooms? You can control them in that you can check in on them. You can go into the room and you can check and make sure that they're all discussing what they should be discussing. But there's not very much that they can do except discuss with each other. That it hasn't gotten to the point, like I said, even in the webinar, it hasn't gotten to the point where you can see the main slide while you're in the breakout room, which I think is probably going to be coming, because it's the next step, right? We would want as teachers to be able to show something and then have people discuss it. So the ability to have the slide where the activity is in the breakout room is probably going to be the next thing that they design. Thank you so much for attending. Very much appreciate your time. We have our final webinar that's scheduled next Thursday. So we hope to see you all back next Thursday, and you'll receive an email invitation from us. Thank you very much.